I'm Richard Taylor from the Philosophy Department at Marquette University and visiting professor at the Catholic University of Leuven. And together with my colleague, Professor Andrea Robilio at the Catholic University of Leuven, we present to you these lectures in connection with our course, Thomas Aquinas on the Nature and Attainment of Happiness, a course offered at Marquette University and KU Leuven thanks to various internet tools. This class number 11, is on Thomas Aquinas and ultimate happiness in his Summa contra gentiles. This video is video 11a, and it concerns some issues of the discussion of ultimate happiness in Summa contra gentiles, Book 3. So let's proceed. First, an overview of these videos. Now, in class earlier, I spoke about the need to drill down into the reasoning and thought of philosophical authors in order to see the starting points or principles that lead to the conclusions that are reached. So we're going to do some of that here today. Here in video 11a, I'm going to do the following. A, I begin by reminding you of our discussion of Aristotle on human happiness, and I cite some passages from Aquinas' Summa contra gentiles, Book 3, where he discusses the limited conception of human fulfillment that Aristotle himself held. And B, I then turn to Aquinas' Summa contra gentiles, Book 3, Chapter 63, to consider his conclusions to the discussion there on ultimate human happiness. Next, C, I offer reflections on the notion of the reditio, or return, a notion Aquinas uses as an essential part of his approach. Then D, sense of error, which is a key source and a key target of critique by Aquinas in the discussion of ultimate happiness in Summa contra gentiles, Book 3, I consider the notion of reditio, or return, in the metaphysics of Avicenna and Averroes, and its ramifications for the metaphysical notions of ultimate happiness. In video 11b, I'll return to Aquinas' Summa contra gentiles, Book 3, Chapters 1 to 3, to review the established principles that Aquinas uses for his account of ultimate happiness in Summa contra gentiles, Book 3, and then I'll provide an explication of key arguments in the remaining assigned readings from Summa contra gentiles 3. Of course, those readings are as indicated here. Book 3, Chapters 1 to 3, Chapters 16 to 21, Chapters 25-26, Chapters 37-44, Chapters 47-48, Chapters 51 to 55, and Chapter 63, and just for fun, Chapter 64 on Providence. And this looks like quite a bit of material, but in fact it flows very well. Aquinas' reasoning is very clear. And I think it's not an onerous task to read this, but rather I think by looking at just these passages, these materials, this finite amount of material, we can do quite well in understanding Aquinas on ultimate human happiness in the Contra Gentiles. So to Aristotle. A. You'll recall that Aristotle writes in the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, he writes of happiness or human fulfillment, eudaimonia, and the need for this to be complete in the sense that the end should be fully achieved and not something intermediary to another greater end. And just who is happy should be determined by a consideration of a complete life, not just a short period of time. That's Aristotle's concerns here. In Nicomachean Ethics, Book 10, Aristotle has reunited the moral virtue with intellectual virtue. Recall that in Book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics, he dealt with issues of moral virtue, and in Book 6, he took up again intellectual virtue. But here in Book 10, he reunites these two to form the notion that there are two sorts of happiness or fulfillment available to human beings. The happiness of the citizen of moral virtue, and the happiness of the citizen who has moral virtue and also high intellectual virtue through the realization of strong natural ability, learning, good habits, and contemplation on top of a foundation of moral virtue. Aquinas makes it clear that he understands Aristotle only to consider happiness during life on earth, in what Aristotle writes in the Nicomachean Ethics. So at Summa contra gentiles, Book 3, Chapter 44, Aquinas writes that knowledge of separate substances cannot be had in this life, so, quote, it is not possible for man's ultimate felicity to consist in a connection with the agent intellect, as some philosophers have said. And of course, some philosophers include Avicenna and Averroes in giving an interpretation of Aristotle. But also other modern interpreters of Aristotle think that he too said that the human fulfillment in knowledge takes place only thanks to a connection with the agent intellect. But more of that perhaps later, or in class discussion. Pardon me. He then writes at the end of the chapter, quote, "It is clear that Aristotle's opinion was that ultimate felicity which man can achieve in this life is the kind of knowledge of divine things that can be gained through the speculative sciences." Speculative, let's translate that as theoretical sciences. Through the theoretical sciences. But that latter way of knowing divine things, not by means of the theoretical sciences, but by a process of generation in natural order, was made up by some of his commentators. That is, Aquinas is saying that some of the commentators on Aristotle made up another way by which we could, in this life, know separate substances. That's Aquinas' view. Among those he has in mind Averroes, but we'll see something about his interpretation of Averroes. Aquinas' conclusion with regard to this in Summa contra gentiles 348 has several reasons why ultimate happiness cannot be in this life. And then he later writes, quote, "Since man's ultimate felicity in this life seems mainly to consist in speculation," it should be translated theoretical study, whereby the knowledge of the truth is sought, as Aristotle himself points out in Ethics 10, "it is impossible to say that man achieves his ultimate end in this life," close quote. So this is something Aquinas is very much concerned with, that in fact we cannot achieve, as he sees it, we cannot achieve our ultimate happiness in this life. And then he reasserts this, saying, quote, "Since Aristotle saw that there is no other knowledge for man in this life than through the speculative sciences, he maintained that man does not achieve perfect felicity, but only a limited kind," close quote. All right, so now let's turn to Aquinas' conclusion at Summa contra gentiles 3, chapter 63. That chapter is entitled, "How Man's Every Desire is Fulfilled in that Ultimate Felicity." And here Aquinas explains that different from other animals, humans have an intellectual desire for knowledge of the truth, and that this is fulfilled only in a contemplative life involving the vision of God as first truth. The fulfillment of a human being with objects of civic desires, with pleasures, or with the desire for self-preservation, these do not bring about complete fulfillment of a human being. Rather, says Aquinas, it is only through the divine vision intellectual substances obtain true felicity, in which their desires are completely brought to rest, and in which is the full sufficiency of all the goods which, according to Aristotle, are required for happiness. He then writes the following, quote, "Now there is nothing in this life so like this ultimate and perfect felicity as the life of those who contemplate truth, to the extent that it is possible in this life." And of course, he's focusing on this because the intellectual understanding is the highest fulfillment of a human being, as Aquinas has shown elsewhere, and we've seen before too. I continue then. And so the philosophers, who were not able to get full knowledge of this ultimate happiness, identified man's ultimate happiness with the contemplation which is possible in this life. That's what Aquinas writes. And so the philosophers are focused in on that. They're not focused in, according to Aquinas anyway, they're not focused in on the next life. Now, key to the account of Aquinas is the notion of procession from God through creation and return to God in ultimate fulfillment, in uniting with the cause of human beings as intellectual beings. This is the notion of reditio, or return. This is a Platonic notion involving participation, such that in struggling to be the best that it can be, any entity seeks perfection in accord with its cause. For Plotinus, the perfection of any particular thing is in its existing in its greatest actuality possible within its species, in such a way that the particular reflects the form which exists in itself in the transcendent nous or intellect from which all forms flow. So this is the participation. And if something participates more fully and more perfectly, then it is a closer image of the transcendent form from which it came. Now note that this is not a complete return to the one in Plotinus, but rather it's a return of a thing toward the perfection of its cause, the cause which it participates and imperfectly imitates in the world. And that cause, in the case of the Plotinian account, is nous, or intellect, where all the forms exist as present. So the return is not completely to the one in this case. Now this notion then requires a procession in the sense of an instantiation of an imperfect particular, which has the characteristic of its formal cause and seeks to realize itself in likeness to its cause to the extent possible for an imperfect particular. That's participation. Now, what about reditio in Avicenna and Averroes? In Avicenna, since the forms of worldly things, including human immaterial rational souls, come from the separately existing agent intellect, the reditio, return, or in fact fulfillment, takes place when the rational soul returns to its cause, the agent intellect. For Avicenna, this is the fulfillment of human happiness at its highest level and involves a sharing with the agent intellect in its knowing and understanding its causes. That is, the hierarchy of intellects and ultimately God. But this knowing fulfillment remains at the level of the emanated agent intellect. There is not a complete return to God here. This is because the rational soul was created by the agent intellect in its function as an intermediary in the formation of the world, an intermediary functioning as mediator of divine will and divine goodness. Still, the return is to the cause of the existence of the human rational soul, namely the agent intellect. Averroes also finds that ultimate human happiness and fulfillment is a sort of return, namely a return to causes through knowing. And for him, what knowledge we are able to garner of the highest causes and God is the very best, because it is of the highest causes. And this is what Aristotle says in Metaphysics, Book 1, Chapters 2 and 3. This knowledge is difficult to obtain, since natural human knowing comes through the senses, for Averroes, and what little we're able to know of the cause through the natural sciences in the course of making use of our powers of abstraction and demonstration. Notice I do not add another kind of understanding here, an intuitive kind or a grasping of the divine light or something like that for Averroes. In Averroes, then, the reditio here is only in this level of knowing. Certainly things try to achieve their own actuality to the extent that they can, in imitation of the full actuality of God as a primary instance of being qua being. But the reditio that takes place for human beings is on the level of knowing. You'll recall that I indicated in last week's video that Averroes used the term iktira, creation as ontological dependence on God through final and formal causality only, rather than the term ibdat, creation as origination by efficient causality of forms and species of things by God, because Averroes did not hold for a doctrine of creation ex nihilo. Recall that for Averroes there are only 4 causes, not 5, with the efficient cause being only the cause of physical motion. So he doesn't have that 5th cause that is characteristic of ibdat, or creation as origination. In fact, Averroes holds that the forms and the structure of reality are in a stable state eternally, And creation is primarily understood in terms of ontological dependence, and not dependent upon an efficient cause. So, given that there is no creation ex nihilo, then for Averroes there's no reason for an ontological reditio to the cause, namely to God, an ontological reditio. There is a reditio of all things, including human beings, to God, insofar as their being, their unity, and their form depend on God as ultimate, final, and formal cause, as the primary instance of being qua being in actuality, that all reality imitates within the limits of natural form and species. For Averroes, then, a human being's identity is primarily with its brain powers, which work with the separate agent intellect and material intellect. In his commentary on the Republic of Plato, Averroes says that there's a natural affiliation between the human mind, brain powers, the human being, with the separate agent intellect and separate material intellect. And human fulfillment, thanks to that, is this highest possible actualization in connection with these intellects. And that's the noetics, or epistemological account of Averroes that we've seen earlier. So the human being has this natural affiliation with the separate intellects, and so in some sense it shares with or participates these separate substances in being rational. And of course we've seen how it does so. That is, the agent intellect acts as the abstracting power, and the material intellect acts as the receiving power. And when we have in our what he calls habitual or speculative or theoretical intellect in ourselves, we human beings down here in the world, we have knowledge in our intellects thanks to a connection with the separate material intellect, which receives the abstractions made from the images presented in memory to the agent intellect. The agent intellect actualizes those images in the material intellect, and they are apprehended then as intelligibles in act. So that's something we've seen earlier. Now, from your reading, you should have noticed that Aquinas speaks of the notion of the separate agent intellect in Averroes as being form for us, in natural human knowing for Averroes. Let's be careful about this term here, because the term form in this context means perfection and completion. So knowing by an individual human being requires the perfection of intellectual abstraction by the power of the agent intellect in order to obtain completion and fulfillment in knowledge. That is, for the individual human being to attain completion and fulfillment in knowledge. Aquinas, however, argues that this form, the agent intellect, will have to be intrinsic to the human being, and so must be the human's constitutive form. But Aquinas says that makes no sense whatsoever, because the agent intellect would then be the form of a human being in the sense that it's its ontological form, and the human being wouldn't be knowing, the agent intellect would be knowing. But this is a very confused account, I'm afraid. So for Averroes, it makes good sense, but for Averroes, this makes good sense, since humans are perishable members of the uncreated human species. Notice the differences here. All species are eternal for Averroes. And as physical, it required the involvement of separate immaterial intellects for the activity of knowing. We do recognize that we have knowledge, and everything that comes into being goes out of being. Hence, our being knowers for the time we are alive requires that connection with the separate intellects. For Averroes, then, ultimate human knowing yields all the fulfillment and happiness possible for a human being in the short period of life available to perishable human beings. That is, the only happiness available to human beings is in science, obtained using primary principles of understanding, abstraction, and philosophical demonstrations. Knowledge itself is the perfection of a human being, and that takes place with the help of the separate intellects and results in the highest fulfillment of a human being. Remember, that's the terminology Aristotle was using. the highest fulfillment of a human being, which also is described as the highest happiness of a human being. Now, regarding the issue of form for us and intellect in Aquinas and Averroes, see the article Intellect as Intrinsic Formal Cause in the Soul according to Aquinas and Averroes in the collection of essays called The Afterlife of the Platonic Soul, Reflections on Platonic Psychology in the Monotheistic Religions. And that was published in 2009. So you might want to have a look at that if you want to look at that issue of form for us and precisely what is meant by that. So this means that while Averroes thought that ultimate fulfillment and happiness is in knowing, he did not hold for a human knowing of the separate substances and the essence of God through the human connection of the agent intellect. Rather, the agent intellect functions for Averroes as a principle for explaining human intellectual understanding, as does the material intellect. The agent intellect has no other function that's attributed to it. It is not a knower of things above. It is not a knower of God and that sort of thing. It's brought forward by Averroes to solve the issue of intellectual abstraction, just as he brought forth the notion of the material intellect as well. The doctrine of human knowing of separate substances through the agent intellect is not that of Averroes, who taught that knowledge of the separate substances is gained through physics and psychology, and developed in discussions of finality and actuality in the science of metaphysics. So that's enough for now with regard to this first video, and the next video is a bit longer, but these are preliminary issues that need to be brought up, and I think we'll be able to see quite clearly what Aquinas is doing in the selected passages that we'll look at next in video 11b. And that's it. Thank you very much.